They say the lantern guides the lost, but here, it...
The compactor was mid-cycle when I heard the screams from the front gate. Metal grinding against metal drowned out most of it. But human terror has a frequency that cuts through everything. I killed the machine and walked toward the noise, clipboard still in hand like I was heading to check a delivery manifest. The security guard, Marcus, was stumbling backward from the entrance, and 3 people were trying to climb the chain-link fence. One of them wasn't climbing anymore. He was being pulled down by something that used to work in the office park next door. I recognized the tie, blue with yellow stripes, the kind middle managers wore to seem approachable. My recycling facility processed industrial waste across 10 acres of sordid chaos. Mountains of copper wire coiled like sleeping dragons near the eastern fence. Aluminum sheets stacked 20 feet high caught the afternoon sun and turned it into blinding panels of light. Crushed cars formed metallic pyramids in the automotive section, each one stripped of useful components before compression. Plastic pellets filled silos that towered over the sorting bays, color-coded by polymer type. The place smelled like oil, rust, and possibility. I'd managed it for 8 years, turning garbage into profit margins that made corporate happy enough to leave me alone. Now I was watching civilization tear itself apart at my front gate, while standing in the middle of more raw materials than most small countries possessed. Marcus made it inside. The fence climbers didn't. I locked the gate mechanism and hit the emergency shutters on the main office building. 17 employees were on site that day. By sunset, it was down to 12. By the end of the first week, 9 of us remained. We didn't talk about the others. We were too busy learning that the world had stopped making things, but people still needed them desperately. The first night we huddled in the control room, watching news feeds disintegrate into static and emergency broadcasts. The disease spread through bites. The infected lost everything human within hours. Language, reasoning, survival instinct beyond feeding. Cities were being evacuated, but the highways looked like parking lots filled with feeding grounds. Communication networks were failing block by block. Supply chains had collapsed before most people realized they should have been hoarding supplies. I looked around at my crew, welders, sorters, machine operators, forklift drivers, and then through the reinforced windows at the acres of materials outside. "We're sitting on a gold mine," I said. Nobody responded. They were still processing the end of the world. I was processing opportunity. Tommy, the lead machinist, was checking the windows for structural integrity. Jake and Dominic, our forklift operators, were going through the break room looking for food. Carter was trying to get the radio working, cycling through static, searching for anything coherent. Marcus had grabbed the facility's emergency firearms, 3 hunting rifles and a shotgun from the security office, and was distributing ammunition. Everyone was moving on autopilot, doing familiar tasks while their brains caught up to the impossible. I pulled up the facility management system. On the main computer, it still had power from our backup generators. The fuel tanks outside held enough diesel to run for 3 months if we were conservative. Solar panels on the warehouse roofs added supplemental power during daylight. We had water from the industrial well. The real wealth was outside those windows, organized, cataloged, ready for transformation. If you've ever realized that everything you took for granted was about to become impossible, you'll understand the clarity that hits your brain. The rules just changed, and I had the raw materials to write new ones. Hit that like button and subscribe. This is where survival becomes industry. Day 2 started with inventory, I sent Jake and Dominic through the yard with tablets to catalog what we actually had. The sorting system had been running for years, which meant materials were already organized by type and grade. The metal section alone could have built a small town. 20 tons of steel beams from demolished buildings, each one tagged with specifications and structural ratings. Enough aluminum to construct aircraft frames, sheets, rods, tubes, all sorted by alloy composition. Copper wiring that stretched for miles when uncoiled, stripped from buildings and sorted by gauge. The plastic repository held everything from PET bottles crushed into dense cubes to industrial-grade polymers still in manufacturer packaging, waiting for processing that would never come. The wood recycling area, mostly pallets and construction waste, covered 2 acres. Oak, pine, maple, hickory, all separated by species and grade. Glass sorted by color-filled designated bins, clear, green, brown, each one representing thousands of bottles and windows reduced to manageable pieces. Electronics waiting for component extraction sat in a climate-controlled warehouse because the precious metals inside were worth more than the devices themselves. Rubber from tires formed black mountains near the southwestern corner, roughly shredded but still useful. We had acids for metal treatment, industrial lubricants, welding equipment, cutting torches, hydraulic presses, and machinery designed to tear things apart with precision. I needed to start thinking about putting things together instead. Marcus was ex-military, which made him valuable beyond security. I found him reinforcing the main gate with angle iron. He'd already figured out the new reality. "We need walls," he said without looking up from his welding. Sparks cascaded across his gloves as the torch bit into metal. Real ones. That fence won't hold when they come in numbers. How many do you think we can expect? All of them, eventually. This place is fortress potential, with sight lines and open ground. But it's also visible from the highway. Once supplies run out in the suburbs, survivors will head toward anything that looks organized. We'll get refugees and raiders. Probably can't tell the difference at first. I watched him work. The angle iron created a secondary barrier behind the chain link. Each piece welded at angles that would make climbing treacherous. He was building overlap points where multiple barriers created kill zones, places where anything trying to force entry would be exposed and vulnerable. Military thinking applied to industrial materials. What do you need? 6 people who can follow instructions. All the sheet metal from Section 7, the welders from the maintenance shop, and 3 days without interruptions. He got 4 days because the infected were still feeding on denser populations. We heard gunfire from the residential zones 5 miles east, constant enough that it became background noise. Helicopters passed overhead, moving south, then stopped coming entirely on day 3. The cell networks died on day 5. Internet lasted another 12 hours after that, servers going dark as power grids failed. The last news report I saw estimated 40% infection rates in major cities with catastrophic casualties. Quarantine zones had failed within hours of establishment. Military responses were fragmented, units cut off from command structure. The government had evacuated to undisclosed locations, which meant they'd given up on the rest of us. While Marcus built walls, I focused on production capability. The main fabrication shop had equipment meant for processing, not manufacturing, but the principles weren't that different. Metal lathes could shape components. Hydraulic presses could form sheets. Cutting torches could provide precision separation. Welding stations could assemble finished products. We had the tools. We just needed to repurpose them. Tommy, Our lead machinist understood metal better than I understood anything. I found him in the workshop staring at the lathe like it was a religious artifact. He'd been running it for 6 years, processing recycled metal into standardized forms for resale. Now he was looking at it with different eyes. "Can you make axe heads?" I asked. He turned slowly. His hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash of the first day. "From what?" "Leaf springs from the automotive section. High carbon steel, already heat-treated for stress resistance." His eyes changed. The glaze of shock started clearing, replaced by the focus I'd seen when he was solving mechanical problems. Yeah, I can do that. Cut them to length, grind the edge profile, drill the handle mounting holes. How many do you want? As many as you can make. Then knives, then spear points, then anything else people can use to stay alive without bullets. Bullets run out, he said quietly. But steel lasts. Exactly. Tommy produced the first axe head by sunset. It wasn't pretty. Rough finish, uneven grinding, obvious tool marks, but the edge was sharp enough to bite into hardwood, and the balance felt right when I mounted it on a handle from the pallet stacks. I tested it on a zombie that had wandered too close to the eastern fence, drawn by the sounds of our activity. One swing took it down. The blade held its edge, barely scratched by bone contact. Tommy watched from the fabrication shop window and nodded before returning to the lathe. By midnight, he had 3 more completed. The water situation was simpler than expected. The facility had its own well for the industrial washers and cooling systems. We weren't drinking it before. It had mineral content and chemical residue from the processing equipment. But Carter said he could make it potable with the right filtration. Carter had been a water treatment tech before taking a job as a forklift operator, because it paid better and had better hours. Now, his previous career was about to save lives. We had activated carbon in the chemical processing area, used for absorption processes, sand and gravel from the aggregate recycling bins, PVC pipe inventory that could have supplied a housing development, sorted by diameter and pressure rating. He built a filtration system in 72 hours using nothing but recycled components and knowledge he'd picked up from his previous career. Multi-stage filtration, sand for particulates, gravel for larger debris, activated carbon for chemicals and taste. He ran the output through twice to be sure. "It tastes like plastic," Jake complained after the first test. "It tastes like not dying of dysentery," Carter shot back. "Drink up or dehydrate. Your choice." The water was safe, tested with chemical strips Carter found in the quality control lab. Not delicious, but clean. That put us ahead of 90% of survivors who were probably drinking from contaminated sources and hoping for the best. Food was the problem. We had vending machines that had been emptied by day 3. The break room refrigerator offered another day of calories before everything went bad, without consistent power. After that, we were looking at starvation unless we figured out supply lines. The infected had cleared out most of the nearby commercial areas, drawn by the concentration of people who'd tried to loot grocery stores during the initial panic. But Marcus thought the industrial park warehouses might still hold inventory. They'd been locked down when the evacuation orders came through, which meant fewer people knew what was inside. "Commercial areas got hit first," he explained. "Everyone knows where the grocery stores are, but industrial suppliers, distribution centers, that's specialist knowledge. Could be full containers sitting there untouched. I put together a scavenging team, Marcus, Jake, and Dominic, armed with the new axes and wearing improvised armor made from leather welding aprons backed with aluminum plates. The aprons were heavy-duty material, designed to stop welding sparks and molten metal splatter. With the aluminum backing, they'd stop teeth. Maybe not bites from multiple infected, but better than nothing. They took one of the facility trucks, a flatbed with a cage already installed for transporting materials, and left at dawn on day 8. I watched them disappear past the gate and wondered if I'd just killed 3 people by sending them out there. They came back 6 hours later with a truck bed full of canned goods, bottled water, and medical supplies. Marcus had a bite mark on his armor where teeth had failed to penetrate. The impression was clear: human dental pattern pressed into aluminum, stopped by the plate backing. Jake was shaking. Dominic looked like he'd aged 5 years, his face pale and drawn. Office Depot had camping supplies, Marcus reported, his voice steady despite the close call. Emergency kits some company ordered before everything collapsed. They were doing disaster preparedness training or something. Nobody touched them. We also hit a medical supply warehouse. Got antibiotics, bandages, surgical equipment. There's more out there, but the infected are spreading into the industrial zones now. Every trip gets more dangerous. Then we make fewer trips, I said, and we start trading instead of scavenging. The concept seemed insane until I explained it. Survivor groups were forming in pockets throughout the region. We'd heard them on the radio. Brief transmissions, people calling out locations and asking for help. Some held apartment complexes. Others fortified strip malls or schools. They had people and maybe weapons, but they didn't have production capability. They couldn't make the things that kept people alive beyond the immediate crisis. We could. I'd already proven it with Tommy's axes and Carter's water filtration. If we scaled up, we could manufacture our way through the apocalypse. You want to start a business, Jake said slowly. During the zombie apocalypse, I want to start an economy. Business implies profit. This is about survival through specialization. We make things. They bring us food, medicine, intelligence, and labor. Everyone lives longer. Marcus understood immediately. We become the arsenal. The supplier. The ones everyone needs but nobody can afford to raid because then the supply stops. Exactly. But first we need to demonstrate value. We need a product showcase. Tommy had already started expanding production. He'd recruited Robert, one of the other workers, to help with grinding and finishing. They had an assembly line forming. Tommy cut and shaped the axe heads on the lathe. Robert ground the edges and drilled mounting holes. Then Tommy did final quality control. They were producing 5 axes per day, working 12-hour shifts. Do you think you'd have the guts to bet everything on industry when everyone else is just trying to survive the day? Drop a comment below about what you'd manufacture first. This decision changed everything. Over the next week, Tommy and Robert produced 20 axe heads. I had Jake and Dominic assembling handles from the hardwood in our lumber section. Ash and hickory that had been destined for furniture before the world ended. Each axe was tested for balance and durability. We swung them against logs, concrete blocks, and eventually infected skulls. The ones that failed got reworked. The ones that passed got marked with identification, a recycling symbol that I carved into each handle with a wood-burning tool from the maintenance shop. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. We were recycling civilization. Simultaneously, I had Carter working on portable water filters, smaller versions of his main system, built into sections of PVC pipe with activated carbon and sand layers. Each one could process contaminated water for a family of 4, maybe 5 gallons a day depending on source water quality. He manufactured 6 prototypes using nothing but recycled components. Each unit was about 2 feet long, 4 inches in diameter, with input and output valves salvaged from industrial equipment. Marcus took a different approach. He started forging spear points from rebar, not elegant, but effective and fast to produce. He heated the rebar in a makeshift forge built from fire bricks and fed by propane torches. Once red hot, he hammered the ends into points and quenched them in oil. A sharpened steel point on an 8-foot pole gave someone reach against infected without requiring skill or strength. He could make 20 a day once he established the rhythm, working in batches with multiple pieces, heating simultaneously. By day 15, we had a product line: axes for close combat and utility, water filters for survival basics, spears for defensive perimeters, each one made from materials that would have been trash in the old world. The hard part was finding customers who weren't trying to kill us. The first trade delegation appeared on day 17. 4 men approached the gate under a white flag made from a torn bedsheet tied to a broom handle. They looked exhausted, underfed, and desperate. Dark circles under their eyes, clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks. They moved carefully, hands visible, showing they weren't carrying weapons openly. Marcus kept them at rifle distance while I walked to the interior fence line. "We're from the Riverside Apartments," their leader called out. He was maybe 40, with graying hair and a voice that carried authority despite obvious fatigue. "60 people holed up there. We've heard you have supplies. We can pay." "With what?" I asked. He held up a duffel bag carefully, making sure we could see it wasn't a weapon. "Medication, food, ammunition, whatever you need. I need people who can work, skills, information about what's happening in the region. And I need to know you won't try to take this facility by force once you know what we have." The negotiation lasted an hour. They wanted axes, water filters, and spear points. Their defensive perimeter was failing because they'd been using kitchen knives and improvised clubs against infected. People were getting injured in close combat, which meant infections, not the zombie kind, the regular bacterial kind that killed you just as dead when there were no hospitals. They needed reach weapons and reliable tools. I wanted safe passage for scavenging runs in their territory, intelligence about infected movements and concentrations, 3 people with fabrication skills willing to relocate to the facility, and a guarantee of safe harbor if my teams needed emergency extraction during supply runs. A place to retreat if things went wrong. We settled on a trial exchange. I'd provide 10 axes and 2 water filters. They'd send 2 workers for a month and guarantee safe harbor. Additionally, they'd share information about what they'd seen in the region, which areas were clear, which were overrun, where other survivor groups were operating. Marcus thought I was being too trusting. They could scout our defenses and come back with force. They could, but they won't get far if they try. And they know it. More importantly, they need us functional more than they need our resources. Anyone can raid a warehouse once. We can produce indefinitely. That's worth more than a short-term raid to anyone thinking beyond next week. The Riverside delegation left with their goods. I watched them load the axes and filters into a shopping cart. Post-apocalyptic logistics at its finest. 2 days later, a middle-aged machinist named Robert and a young welder named Chris arrived at our gate with backpacks and tool belts. They'd been manufacturing engineers before the outbreak, working at a plant that made automotive components. Now they were refugees, trading their skills for safety and steady meals. "Welcome to the new industrial revolution," I told them. "Everything you make here keeps someone alive. No pressure." Robert laughed, but it sounded hollow. Chris just stared at the mountains of materials like he'd found religion. "I thought we'd be scavenging forever," he said quietly, "running from one depleted location to another until we starved or got caught. This is different. This is sustainable," I said. "Or as sustainable as anything gets when the dead walk. Come on, I'll show you the operation." By the end of week 3, we had trade relationships with 4 survivor enclaves. Each one brought different resources. The apartment complex had medical supplies from a doctor who'd been trapped there during the initial outbreak. Dr. Patterson was 70 years old and couldn't do field medicine anymore, but he knew which drugs did what and how to properly dose them. His people brought antibiotics, pain medication, and surgical supplies in exchange for tools and spear points. A fortified warehouse community controlled access to a grocery distribution center that still held inventory. They were sitting on thousands of cans and dried goods, but desperately needed weapons and water purification. Their location had a contaminated water source, probably sewage, backing up into the supply lines when the city systems failed. Carter's filters were worth their weight in gold to them. A group of veterans occupying a National Guard armory offered ammunition and tactical training in exchange for tools and equipment repairs. Their facility had weapons, but their maintenance equipment had been inadequate even before the collapse. They needed Tommy to machine replacement parts for their vehicles and weapons. In return, they taught us small unit tactics, defensive positioning, and proper firearms handling. The 4th group was different. They showed up with nothing but skills: electricians, carpenters, and a chemical engineer named David, who'd worked in pharmaceutical manufacturing. They didn't want goods. They wanted asylum and the chance to keep working at what they knew. Their previous location had been overrun. They'd barely escaped. They had the clothes on their backs and knowledge in their heads. I accepted immediately. David alone was worth his weight in copper. He took one look at our chemical inventory and started talking about disinfectant production, basic medication synthesis, and water treatment scalability. "You've got the precursors for antiseptic compounds," he said, walking through the chemical storage area like a kid in a candy store. His fingers traced labels on containers, alcohols, acids, bases, and with the right processes I can synthesize basic painkillers. Nothing advanced, but better than nothing when the aspirin runs out. "You've also got everything I need for industrial-scale disinfectant production. If we're going to prevent normal infections from killing people, we need to sanitize wounds and equipment." I gave him a budget of $0, unlimited access to recycled materials, and one assistant, a young worker named Miguel who'd been studying chemistry before dropping out to work full-time. David started producing usable antiseptic within 4 days, using alcohol compounds, hydrogen peroxide, and careful measurements. The facility was transforming. What had been a recycling operation became a manufacturing complex. The main sorting area converted into a production floor with stations for different goods. Tommy's metalworking section expanded to include Robert and Chris, tripling our output of tools and weapons. They established specializations. Tommy handled precision work. Robert focused on mass production. Chris did all welding and assembly. Together, they were producing 20 axes and 30 spear points daily. Carter's water treatment operation grew into a full purification station, producing hundreds of gallons daily. He'd trained 2 assistants to run the system in shifts, maintaining consistent output. The portable filters were in such high demand that he'd created an assembly line for those too, cutting pipe, loading filter media, installing valves, testing each unit. David's chemical lab occupied the old quality control building. He'd set up proper ventilation using industrial exhaust fans and ductwork. His production included antiseptic solution, basic soap from rendered fats and lye, and a crude painkiller derived from willow bark and chemical enhancement. None of it would pass FDA approval, but the FDA wasn't operating anymore. We established a shift system. Production ran 16 hours a day with rotating crews. Everyone pulled guard duty on the walls Marcus had built, now reinforced with watchtowers made from scaffolding and sheet metal. The perimeter expanded to include the entire 10-acre facility, with sightlines cleared and approach routes covered by observers. We mounted spotlights powered by our generators for night watch. The infected still came, but in smaller numbers. The initial wave had consumed the easiest targets, people caught in the open, trapped in buildings, stuck in traffic. Now the infected wandered in scattered packs, drawn by noise or movement, but lacking coordination. We dealt with them systematically. Spears from the walls for anything that approached, axes for close encounters if something got through, fire for disposal of bodies to prevent accumulation near the perimeter. It became routine, which was almost worse than terrifying. The horror normalized. Week 5 brought our first major test. A group calling themselves the Scavenger Coalition sent representatives demanding tribute, 20 armed men on motorcycles and trucks, carrying automatic weapons and attitude. Their leader, a shaved-headed man who introduced himself as Garrett, made his position clear. He had the confident posture of someone who'd been taking what he wanted without resistance. You're operating in our territory. That means you pay tax, food, water, weapons, and fuel, weekly deliveries, or we take everything and burn what's left. Marcus had 6 rifles trained on them from concealed positions. I'd known this was coming eventually. Every post-apocalyptic society develops predators, people who'd rather take than make, who saw the collapse as opportunity for dominance rather than survival challenge. I've got a better offer, I said. You leave now, and I won't manufacture weapons for every survivor group in the region specifically designed to kill raiders. You stay hostile, and I'll make sure every enclave knows you're the enemy and has the tools to prove it. Garrett laughed. You think you can outgun us with homemade axes? No. I think I can outproduce you, outtrade you, and turn you into everyone's common enemy. You've got bullets. I've got the only functioning factory in the region and trade relationships with communities that outnumber you 10 to 1. You want a war of attrition with the guy who controls the supply chain? Go ahead. See how long you last when every survivor group has better weapons than kitchen knives and knows you're the threat to mutual survival. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds. Garrett's smirk faded as he did the math. Raiders operated on fear and overwhelming force, but force required supplies, and supplies required either scavenging or production. He had the former, I had the latter, and everyone else would side with the supplier over the parasite. This isn't over, he said. Yes, it is. You just haven't realized it yet. Now get off my property before I stop being diplomatic. They left. Marcus exhaled slowly. That was either brilliant or suicidal. Bit of both. But he'll spread the word we're not easy targets. And the enclaves will hear we stood up to raiders, which makes us better allies. Reputation matters now more than ever. What if he comes back with more people? Then we make sure everyone else knows what happens when raiders threaten the only manufacturing center in the region. We turn it into a collective defense problem. His 20 guns against our production capability backing 50 communities. He loses that fight. The next day, I sent word through all our trade partners about the Scavenger Coalition, described them, their vehicles, their tactics. made it clear they were hostile to the mutual aid network we were building. Within a week, I heard reports that 3 enclaves had turned them away at gunpoint. One group had actively fought them off. Garrett's operation was finding that being the enemy of the regional manufacturer made them everyone's enemy. By week 6, we had expanded to 15 workers on site and trade relationships with 8 survivor communities. The facility operated at capacity, every station producing constantly. We'd established a currency system based on labor hours and material value. Communities that provided raw materials, scrap metal, chemicals, food supplies, got credit toward manufactured goods. Communities that sent workers got priority on production. Everyone had incentive to keep us operational. The transformation was remarkable. We'd gone from terrified refugees to industrial hub in less than 2 months. The facility produced tools, weapons, water filters, chemical supplies, and custom fabrications on request. Tommy was working on a design for a simple crossbow using recycled materials. David had successfully synthesized a fever reducer. Carter had designed a rainwater collection system that could be built from our materials. I held a meeting with all workers to discuss expansion. We were packed into the control room, 15 people where 5 had been comfortable. We need more space and more people, I said. The demand is exceeding our production capability. Every community wants what we're making. We're turning down orders. Where do we expand? Marcus asked. We fortified this facility, but taking on more territory means more perimeter to defend. The industrial park next door. 3 buildings already partially fenced, close enough to integrate into our defense perimeter. It's been cleared of infected according to the veteran group. We take it, we double our production space. And who do we recruit? Tommy asked. We need skilled workers, not just bodies. We recruit from the communities. Put out word we're hiring. Offer security, steady food. Purpose. People are tired of just surviving. Give them the chance to build something. The expansion took 3 weeks to plan and execute. We cleared the adjacent buildings with help from the veteran group, room by room, methodical and careful. Found a dozen infected that had been trapped inside and dealt with them. The buildings were intact, with power infrastructure we could connect to our generators, water lines we could tap into Carter's purification system, loading docks and open floor plans perfect for manufacturing. The expansion changed everything. By week 9, we had 32 workers living on site and production capacity that would have impressed pre-collapse operations managers. The 3 additional buildings gave us specialized zones. Building 1 became dedicated metalworking with Tommy, overseeing 6 machinists running lathes, presses, and fabrication equipment around the clock. Building 2 housed Carter's water operation and David's chemistry lab, now scaled to industrial production levels. Building 3 became assembly and quality control, where finished goods were tested, marked with our recycling symbol brand, and prepared for distribution. Marcus had integrated the new buildings into our defensive perimeter, using shipping containers filled with compacted scrap metal as mobile walls. The containers created choke points and overlapping fields of fire, while remaining modular enough to reconfigure if we needed to adapt. Watchtowers now stood at each corner of the expanded compound, manned 24 hours with rotating shifts. We'd mounted salvaged vehicle headlights as spotlights, powered by our growing solar array. The place looked less like a recycling center and more like a fortified industrial complex, which is exactly what it had become. The workforce expansion brought new talent that multiplied our capabilities. A former automotive engineer named Warren redesigned our production workflows for efficiency. He implemented assembly line principles that doubled output without requiring more raw materials. A glassblower named Simon, who'd survived the initial outbreak by hiding in his studio, brought skills nobody else possessed. He started producing laboratory glassware for David's chemical operations and simple glass containers for storing medications and supplies. An electrician named Raymond got our entire solar panel array optimized and began working on a project to build simple radios from salvaged electronics. Trade networks expanded exponentially. By week 10, we had relationships with 23 survivor communities ranging from a dozen people to several hundred. Each one specialized in something. Agricultural groups growing food in fortified greenhouses, medical enclaves run by healthcare workers, scavenging teams that stripped industrial sites we couldn't reach, intelligence networks that tracked infected movements and raider activities. We became the hub connecting all of them, the marketplace where food became tools, medicine became weapons, information became security. The currency system evolved naturally. We issued credit tokens made from stamped aluminum discs, each one representing an hour of labor or a standardized unit of material value. Communities earned tokens by providing resources or workers. They spent tokens on manufactured goods. The system created economic incentives for cooperation and mutual support. Nobody wanted to destabilize the network because everyone benefited from its function. I started receiving delegation visits almost daily. Community leaders wanted to discuss trade agreements, resource allocation, joint defense pacts, and expansion opportunities. My office, formerly the facility manager's workspace overlooking the main floor, became a conference room where the New World's economy was being negotiated, one deal at a time. But success creates visibility, and visibility creates problems. Week 11 brought a visitor who changed the nature of everything we'd built. His name was Colonel Patterson, no relation to the doctor, and he arrived with a convoy of military vehicles and 40 soldiers. They approached under a flag of truce, but the firepower made it clear they could have approached however they wanted. Marcus met them at the outer perimeter, while I watched from the tower. "We need to talk," Patterson called out. He was maybe 50, with gray hair cut military short and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I represent the provisional government operating out of the Fort Henderson complex. We've been monitoring your operation." I climbed down from the tower and walked to the inner fence line. Monitoring how? Radio intercepts, scout reports, intelligence from communities you trade with. You've built something remarkable here, an entire manufacturing economy from scratch. The provisional government wants to establish formal relations. What kind of relations? You need security from raiders and infected hordes. We need production capability. The military has personnel, weapons, and organization, but our supply chains are dead. We can't manufacture replacement parts, tools, or equipment. You can. Marcus shifted beside me, hand near his weapon. The soldiers weren't pointing guns at us, but they weren't exactly relaxed either. This was a negotiation between powers, not a simple trade discussion. "What are you proposing?" I asked. "Alliance, we provide military protection for your facility and trade network. You provide manufacturing capability for military equipment and supplies. We establish joint governance over the region's survivor communities. Your economic authority combined with our security structure. Together, we rebuild civilization instead of watching it fragment into warring tribes." It sounded reasonable. It also sounded like a takeover dressed in diplomatic language. And if I decline, Patterson's expression didn't change. "Then we respect your sovereignty and withdraw. But you should know, that without military-grade security, facilities like yours become targets. The scavenger coalition you pushed back. They're small time. There are organized groups out there with hundreds of fighters who'll eventually hear about the recycling center that became an industrial hub. When they come, homemade spears won't be enough. He wasn't threatening. He was stating facts. I'd known it since Garrett's visit. We were valuable enough that eventually someone with serious force would try to take what we'd built. Military alliance could prevent that. It could also end our independence. I need to discuss this with my people, I said. Of course, we'll establish a camp outside your perimeter. Take your time, but not too much time. The region's getting more dangerous, not less. If you've ever had to choose between independence and survival, you know the weight of that decision. Comment below about what you'd do. Risk freedom or risk annihilation. This choice defined everything that came after, so subscribe to see how it played out. The emergency meeting lasted 4 hours. Every worker with decision-making authority crowded into the control room. Marcus, Tommy, Carter, David, Warren, and representatives from the major trade communities who happened to be on site for negotiations. The debate got heated fast. We can't trust the military, Carter argued. History shows what happens when armed forces take control of economic resources. We become their factory, and they become our masters. History also shows what happens to valuable targets without adequate defense. Marcus countered. Patterson's right. We're building something everyone wants. Eventually, someone with more guns than morals will try to take it. We can partner with organized military or fight raiders piecemeal until one of them gets lucky. Tommy leaned back in his chair. What do we actually lose if we ally with them? We're already making weapons and tools. Military contracts just mean more production of what we're already doing. If we maintain control of operations and they handle security, that's division of labor, basic economics. We lose autonomy, I said. Once we're embedded with military authority, we can't easily separate. If they make decisions we disagree with, we're stuck. And provisional government sounds official, but we don't know who's running it or what their agenda is beyond survival. David, who'd been quiet, spoke up. I worked in pharmaceutical manufacturing. Every company made drugs, but some did it ethically and others cut corners for profit. The chemistry didn't change. The governance did. We can ally with military structure without surrendering our principles if we negotiate the right terms. What terms? I asked. Operational independence. We agree to produce materials for military use, but we maintain control of production priorities, worker treatment, and trade relationships. They provide security, but don't dictate policy. Joint governance means joint decision-making, not military command structure. We're partners, not subordinates. Marcus nodded slowly. Draw a line. They protect. We produce. Overlap only where necessary. Make it clear we're not a military asset to be deployed. We're an allied economic power. Finally, we had consensus on negotiating points. Operational independence, joint council governance with equal representation, protection for all existing trade relationships, and a clause allowing separation if either party violated terms. It was a framework, not a surrender. I met with Patterson the next morning. His camp had established itself professionally, tents in organized rows, perimeter security, command structure visible in how soldiers moved and interacted. These weren't desperate survivors playing soldier. They were actual military operating under discipline and training. Patterson listened to our terms without interrupting. When I finished, he pulled out a tablet. Somehow they had power and electronics still functioning, and made notes. Most of this is acceptable. The provisional government wants stable allies, not conquered territories. But I need to add terms of my own. Go ahead. Priority production for military equipment when threats emerge. Not exclusive production, but priority. If we're defending this region, we need adequate supplies to do it effectively. Second, intelligence sharing. You have trade networks that give you visibility across the region. We have military reconnaissance. Combining those gives everyone better security. Third, joint response to major threats. If raiders mass for an attack or infected hordes migrate through, we coordinate defense using both military force and your manufacturing capability. Priority production is acceptable if we define priority clearly. Emergency situations, not routine requests jumping the line ahead of community needs. Intelligence sharing works if it's reciprocal and doesn't compromise our trade relationships. Joint response is fine as long as our people aren't conscripted into military operations. We negotiated details for 3 hours. The final agreement established the Regional Stability Coalition, a governing structure with joint military and economic authority. Patterson's military would provide security and coordinate defense. My facility would provide manufacturing and economic organization. A council with equal representation from military command, manufacturing leadership, and major trade communities would make policy decisions. Neither side could act unilaterally on matters affecting the region. It wasn't perfect, but it was workable. More importantly, it was something neither side could have built alone. Military force without production capability meant slow degradation as equipment failed. Production without security meant vulnerability to anyone willing to use violence. Together, we had the foundation for something that might actually last. The alliance announcement went through our trade networks like electricity through copper wire. Reactions were mixed. Some communities celebrated. Finally, organized security against raiders and infected. Others worried about military authority returning, bringing pre-collapse power structures they'd been glad to escape. Most adopted a wait-and-see approach, continuing trade relationships while evaluating whether the coalition actually improved their situation. Week 13 brought validation of the alliance. A raider group, not Garrett's outfit, but a larger operation calling themselves the Reapers, attacked a farming community we traded with. They had maybe 60 fighters with military weapons, vehicles, and coordination that suggested former military or law enforcement leadership. They'd hit 3 communities in 2 weeks, taking everything and burning what remained. The farming community sent a desperate radio call. Patterson mobilized his forces within 20 minutes. I sent Marcus with a truck full of weapons and a squad of our trained defenders. The combined response arrived while the Reapers were still looting. The fight lasted maybe 15 minutes. Military discipline and superior firepower overwhelmed the raiders. We lost 2 soldiers, and one of my workers, the Reapers, lost 23 fighters and retreated in disarray. The surviving farmers were grateful, but I was calculating. 2 dead, 3 wounded, ammunition expended, equipment damaged. The economic cost of defense was significant. But the alternative, losing trade partners to raiders, would have been worse. This was the new math. Violence as economic policy, defense as production cost, human life measured against survival of the network. After the battle, I walked through the farm community. Buildings were damaged, crops trampled, bodies, both raiders and defenders, lay where they'd fallen. A young farmer, maybe 20 years old, was sitting against a wall crying. His brother had died defending the greenhouse. I didn't have words for him. What do you say when loss is the price of survival? I just sat there for a while, two people processing trauma in silence. Eventually he spoke. Is it worth it? Building all this? Trying to bring things back? When people still just take? I don't know, I said honestly. But the alternative is everyone taking and destroying until nothing's left. At least this way. Some things grow. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. We sat there watching the sun set over damaged fields that might produce a harvest if they had time and safety to recover. The Reaper attack and our response reshaped regional dynamics. Other raider groups heard what happened and reconsidered their strategies. Some dissolved, members drifting into legitimate communities. Others consolidated, becoming more dangerous but also more visible targets. The coalition became known as something that fought back effectively, which deterred casual predation but attracted attention from serious threats. Week 15 brought a different kind of challenge. A delegation from a community 30 miles north arrived with a proposal. They'd found a manufacturing plant, electronics assembly, largely intact with equipment and component inventory. They wanted to establish a subsidiary operation using our model: organized production, trade relationships, economic cooperation. But they needed startup help, technical expertise, initial materials, and security guarantees. It was the first request to replicate what we'd built. I discussed it with the council. Patterson saw strategic value in expanding the manufacturing network. More production centers meant distributed capacity, harder to destroy with a single strike. Tommy worried about sharing proprietary techniques. Carter thought it was inevitable. If we didn't help them, they'd figure it out anyway and might become competitors instead of partners. We agreed to support the northern facility under specific terms. We'd send technical advisors and initial material supplies. They'd join the coalition structure and trade network. They'd produce electronics and components while we focused on metalworking and chemistry. Specialization instead of competition. Warren and Simon traveled north with a security detachment to assess the facility. They came back enthusiastic. The plant had equipment for circuit board assembly, wire manufacturing, and basic electronics production. With our chemical supplies and their technical capability, they could produce radios, batteries, and electrical components the region desperately needed. The northern facility became operational by week 18. Their first production run was simple radios built from salvaged components and our chemical batteries. Suddenly, communities could communicate beyond line of sight. Intelligence sharing became real-time. Threats could be reported and responded to faster. The economic and security benefits rippled through the network immediately. Other communities noticed. By week 20, we had 3 more proposals for satellite facilities. A textile operation that could produce clothing and fabric goods, a ceramics workshop that could manufacture pottery and refractory materials, and a biofuel distillery that could produce ethanol from agricultural waste. Each one added capability to the network. Each one strengthened the economic web, keeping communities alive. I was spending more time on economic coordination than production management. The facility ran itself now. Workers knew their roles, production lines operated efficiently, trade relationships were established routine. My role shifted to strategic planning and network expansion. It felt strange going from hands-on management to administrative coordination, but the scale demanded it. Month 6 brought our biggest challenge yet. A massive infected horde, thousands of them, migrated through the region drawn by noise from a military engagement 50 miles west. Patterson's scouts reported them 3 days out, moving slowly but inexorably toward population centers. Every community in their path would be overrun. The horde was too large to fight directly. We needed a different approach. The emergency council meeting included military commanders, facility managers, and community representatives. 20 people crowded around a map marked with the horde's projected path and our community locations. "We can't evacuate everyone," Patterson said. "The horde moves too fast and covers too much ground. We need to redirect them." "How do you redirect thousands of infected?" someone asked. "Noise and fire," Marcus said. "They're drawn to stimulus. Create bigger stimulus away from communities. Lead them toward empty territory." Warren was already calculating. We'd need massive sound projection. Vehicle-mounted speakers, amplified broadcasts, sustained for hours, and fire barriers to create boundaries, channel them where we want them to go rather than letting them spread. "We have the materials," I said. "Speakers from the electronics facility, fuel from the biofuel operation, vehicles from our motor pool. The question is whether we can assemble it fast enough and whether anyone survives implementing the plan." David leaned forward. "We could also use chemical attractants. Infected respond to scent. If we synthesize compounds that mimic stress pheromones or blood chemistry, we could enhance the audio lures, make them irresistible." The plan came together over 6 hours of intense discussion. We'd establish a sound corridor, using vehicle-mounted speakers playing loud, irregular noises designed to attract infected attention. Chemical lures would be placed along the route to reinforce attraction. Fire barriers would channel the horde away from communities and toward an industrial zone that had already been cleared. A killing ground where geography and remaining infrastructure would break up the horde's cohesion. Military forces would harass the flanks, keeping them moving forward, rather than dispersing laterally. It was desperate and dangerous. If the plan failed, the horde would scatter into communities with nowhere left to retreat. But doing nothing guaranteed those communities would be overrun anyway. Implementation took 48 hours of non-stop work. The electronics facility produced speaker arrays. David's lab synthesized chemical lures in quantities that used up weeks of supply reserves. Mechanical teams mounted equipment on vehicles. Patterson organized his forces into harassment teams with ammunition reserves and escape routes. Every community sent volunteers, fighters, drivers, technical support. Over 200 people working on a plan that might save thousands or kill everyone involved. I was in one of the League vehicles driving ahead of the horde to place chemical lures. Marcus was beside me with a rifle. The infected weren't visible yet, but we could hear them. A low moan that carried on the wind, thousands of voices creating sustained noise like distant machinery. "You didn't have to come," Marcus said. "You're too valuable to risk." Everyone's valuable. That's the whole point of what we built. Besides, I need to see if this works. Can't coordinate the economy if I don't understand what we're coordinating. We placed the lures, glass containers filled with David's chemical compounds, designed to break and release over time. Each one was positioned to reinforce the audio corridor, creating an irresistible path. Then we drove like hell to get ahead of the horde before they arrived. The infected appeared at dusk. From the observation point, a water tower 3 miles from the corridor. They looked like a living tide, thousands of bodies moving with horrible unity, responding to instincts we'd weaponized against them. The speakers activated, blaring emergency sirens and distress signals. The horde oriented toward the sound like iron to a magnet. For 6 hours we maintained the corridor. Vehicles leapfrogged ahead, keeping the sound source moving. Military teams fired into the flanks when infected started dispersing. The chemical lures worked exactly as David predicted. Infected clustered around them, fighting each other to reach the source before continuing toward the speakers. The horde funneled into the industrial zone around midnight. Abandoned factories and warehouses created natural barriers. The military had pre-positioned explosives and fuel drums. As the concentration reached critical mass, they triggered the prepared traps. Explosions tore through the horde. Fuel fires created barriers and crematoriums. The killing ground earned its name. By dawn, the horde was broken. Thousands destroyed. Scattered groups manageable by conventional defense. We'd lost 17 people in the operation. Vehicle accidents, infected that broke through the flanks. One team that got cut off and overrun. I read their names at the memorial service 3 days later, and wondered if I'd sent them to die, or if they'd chosen to risk death to save others. Probably both. Have you ever had to implement a plan where success and failure both meant casualties? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe, because this is where industrial survival became something bigger. The horde operation changed perceptions of what the coalition could accomplish. We'd coordinated multiple facilities, dozens of communities, and military forces to solve a problem that would have destroyed the region otherwise. Communities that had been skeptical about the coalition started actively supporting it. Trade relationships deepened. More facilities requested incorporation into the network. By month 8, the coalition encompassed 43 communities and 6 manufacturing facilities. Our original recycling center remained the hub, but the network had become distributed and resilient. Destroying any single location wouldn't collapse the system. The economy had gained momentum that existed beyond individual components. Production capabilities expanded beyond survival basics into rebuilding infrastructure. The textile facility was producing cloth for clothing, shelter, and medical supplies. The ceramics workshop made water pipes, storage vessels, and refractory materials for metalworking. The biofuel distillery powered vehicles and generators. The electronics facility produced radios, batteries, and simple computing devices. We were approaching pre-collapse capability in specific domains, all built from recycled materials and desperate innovation. I met with community leaders monthly now. Full council sessions where we discussed resource allocation, expansion priorities, security threats, and long-term planning. Long-term was anything beyond next season, but even thinking that far ahead represented progress from the early days of hourly survival. One meeting focused on education. Children were growing up in this new world. If we didn't teach them skills and knowledge, everything we'd built would degrade within a generation. Communities had teachers and parents educating kids informally, but we needed systematic coordination. We should establish schools, proposed a community leader named Jennifer who'd been a principal before the outbreak. Formal education covering practical skills, academic knowledge, and social organization. We've proven humans can rebuild. Now we need to teach the next generation how to maintain it. What would we teach? Someone asked. Reading, math, science, history. Don't let knowledge disappear because we're focused on survival. Also practical skills. Metalworking, agriculture, engineering, medicine. Create apprenticeship programs attached to facilities. Kids learn by doing while getting education that makes them more capable adults. The proposal passed unanimously. Within 2 months, we had school programs operating in major communities, using teachers from our network and practical training at manufacturing facilities. Tommy took on apprentices in metalworking. David trained assistants in chemistry. Warren taught engineering principles. The education became another thread in the network, binding generations together through knowledge transfer. Month 10 brought contact from beyond our region. A long-range radio transmission reached our electronics facility from a community 300 miles south. They'd heard rumors of the Regional Stability Coalition and wanted to establish communication. They had their own manufacturing base, mostly agricultural processing and textile production, and were interested in trade relationships. The transmission changed our understanding of what was possible. We'd been focused on regional survival, assuming the rest of the world was similar scattered survivors. But if there was organized industry 300 miles away, there might be others. Maybe civilization was rebuilding in pockets across the continent. Maybe we were nodes in a larger network that hadn't connected yet. Patterson and I discussed sending an expedition south. It would be dangerous. 300 miles through unknown territory, potential raider groups, infected populations, resource scarcity. But establishing long-distance trade could provide resources and knowledge we couldn't generate locally. The expedition would need to be military protected, well-supplied, and prepared for month-long absence. We assembled a team, 10 military personnel led by Marcus, 5 trade representatives including Tommy and Warren, and 3 vehicles loaded with trade goods and supplies. They left on a cold morning in month 11, disappearing down the highway that had once been clogged with fleeing refugees. They came back 6 weeks later with 2 additional vehicles and representatives from 4 communities they'd encountered along the route. The southern group was real, a coalition of agricultural and textile communities that had survived by focusing on food and clothing production. They needed tools and metalworking capability. We needed consistent food supplies and fabric. The trade potential was enormous. More importantly, they'd learned that other regions were organizing similarly. The southeastern coast had maritime communities, rebuilding fishing and shipping infrastructure. The mountain regions had mining operations, extracting raw materials. The Midwest had agricultural collectives producing food on a scale we couldn't match. Civilization was rebuilding, not as a unified nation, but as interconnected economic networks. "We're not alone," Marcus said in his report to the council. "There are thousands of communities out there, maybe hundreds of thousands of survivors, all doing what we're doing, figuring out how to live in this world. We found evidence of radio networks, trade routes, even diplomatic relationships between regional coalitions. It's not the old world, but it's not the end of humanity either." The knowledge was electrifying. For months, we'd been focused on immediate survival and local rebuilding. Now we understood we were part of something larger, a spontaneous reorganization of human society, adapting to catastrophic change. We weren't preserving the old world. We were building something new from its materials. Year 1 ended with the coalition stable, productive, and expanding. The recycling center that had been my management responsibility was now the industrial heart of a regional economy. 43 communities depended on our production. 6 satellite facilities extended manufacturing capability. Trade routes stretched hundreds of miles. Education programs were training the next generation. Military security kept raiders at bay and managed infected populations as ongoing hazard rather than existential threat. I stood in the observation tower one evening watching the facility operate under floodlights. Workers moved between buildings on familiar routes. Machinery hummed with productivity. Smoke rose from forges and chemical processes. It was industrial, loud, and far from beautiful, but it was alive, functional, purposeful. Tommy climbed the tower to join me. "You ever think about what we've built here?" "Constantly. Sometimes I'm amazed we pulled it off." Other times I'm terrified it'll collapse. It won't collapse. Too many people have stakes in keeping it running. That's what you figured out that first week. Make yourself essential by making things people need. Simple economics, but it saved us. Economics and luck. If that first trade delegation hadn't shown up, or if the military alliance had gone differently, or if that horde had scattered instead of funneling. But it did work. And when it works, you build on it. That's what we're doing. Building on what works, adapting what doesn't. Surviving until surviving becomes living. Somewhere along the way, we transitioned from survival to something that resembled life. Not the comfortable existence of the pre-collapse world, but purposeful existence with connections, community, and construction of something beyond immediate needs. "What do you think we'll be in another year?" I asked. Tommy considered. "Bigger, more connected. Maybe stable enough that we stop measuring time in months since the outbreak and start thinking about futures plural. Kids in those schools will grow up in this world, not the one we lost. They'll build things we can't imagine because they won't be constrained by what used to be." Patterson's voice requesting authorization for a night patrol route through a newly mapped area. I climbed down to respond, back to the practical decisions that kept everything functioning. But Tommy's words stayed with me. We'd converted a recycling center into a manufacturing hub, transformed garbage into tools, weapons, and infrastructure. Built an economy from collapse, connected communities into networks, survived by making ourselves valuable and sharing that value broadly enough that everyone wanted us to keep operating. It wasn't the world we'd lost, but it was a world we were building. One piece of recycled steel, one trade agreement, one student apprentice at a time. One person's trash had literally become everyone's treasure when civilization's supply chains ended. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build on. The observation tower lights reflected off the mountains of sorted materials still waiting for transformation. Copper wire, aluminum sheets, plastic pellets, rubber, glass, wood, all the components of civilization waiting to be reformed. We'd barely scratched the surface of what was possible. The real work was just beginning. But tonight, the facility hummed with productivity. Communities slept safely behind, defenses are production-enabled. Tomorrow, we'd make more tools, more weapons, more solutions to problems we'd discover along the way. The recycling never stopped. Neither did we. That's how you survive the apocalypse. Not by hiding or hoarding, but by building value others need, and sharing it widely enough to create mutual stake in everyone's survival. Simple economics. Complex implementation. But it works. If this story resonated with you, the idea that even collapse creates opportunities for those willing to work and build, share it. Someone else needs to hear that survival isn't about going it alone. It's about making yourself useful and connecting to others doing the same. That's not just apocalypse strategy. That's how civilization works in any era. The facility kept running, the network kept growing, and somewhere in the darkness beyond our lights, other communities were probably doing the same thing, recycling the old world into something new. Maybe someday we'd connect with all of them, build trade routes across continents, reconstruct civilization not as restoration but as reinvention. Until then, we had work to do. Materials to process, goods to manufacture, communities to supply, apprentices to train, a region to defend and an economy to grow. The apocalypse hadn't ended humanity. It had just changed the rules, and I'd proven that someone who understood both industrial processes and human needs could write new rules that kept people alive and building. That was worth something, maybe everything. The end.